A Christmas tale turned nightmare. What was she hiding under the festive costume? Christmas, a time of joy, celebration, and family warmth. But for Rick, this year's holiday started with heartache. It all began before Bella slipped into her festive costume, along with the mask she seemed to have recently adopted. The office party had always been a cherished holiday tradition for them. It was a chance to feel part of something bigger, to present themselves as the perfect couple to friends and colleagues. But this year, something was off. Rick, usually self-assured, found himself trapped in an unsettling whirlwind of emotions. It started when Bella's behavior began to shift. The first red flag was her noticeable lack of attention toward him throughout the evening. She seemed distant, as if lost in another world, detached and cold, even when laughing loudly with others. That was the moment Rick realized something was happening, though he couldn't quite put his finger on it. Nothing felt the same. Rick kept catching her gaze lingering on unfamiliar men who attended the party. They were her colleagues, yet her glances seemed too lingering, too deliberate. The moments when their eyes met became painfully obvious to Rick, sending pangs of suspicion through him. Deep down, something told him things weren't right, but he couldn't explain why. Throughout the night, Rick tried to mask his tension. He laughed, joked, and mingled with guests, but his eyes were constantly searching for Bella, tracking her every move. Each time their gazes met, he felt the connection between them dissolve, as though they were strangers now, even while standing side by side. By the end of the evening, as guests began leaving, Bella was still engrossed in conversation with one of her colleagues. Rick stood aside, waiting, trying to keep his composure. He could no longer hold back and decided to approach her. "Bella, are we leaving?" he asked, keeping his voice as calm as possible. "You're leaving already?" Her voice was cold, unfamiliar. She looked at him as though she hadn't even heard his question. "You look tired. Maybe you need some rest," Rick suggested gently, though his words sounded forced. He struggled to make sense of what was happening, but couldn't leave his concerns unspoken. "I'll just finish talking to John, and then we can go," she replied, turning back to the man she had been speaking with moments earlier. Rick was taken aback by her aloofness and convinced himself it was just a temporary lapse. Yet, deep inside, he felt something was off. He couldn't pinpoint what bothered him, but watching Bella immerse herself in conversation with John, he knew this wasn't just another Christmas celebration. When his suspicions began to grow, they reached a breaking point within minutes. Rick saw Bella and John share a warm goodbye hug before stepping outside. It seemed harmless enough, old friends embracing, but for Rick, it was the last straw. He wasn't a jealous man, yet the feelings that surged inside him couldn't be ignored. Each time they touched, he felt his chest tighten. As the party wrapped up, Rick knew he had to address the matter. He couldn't let things fester. They got into the car, and Rick remained silent for the entire drive. Bella, preoccupied with her phone, was busy typing messages and staring at the screen. Unable to contain himself any longer, Rick decided to confront her. "Bella, are you hiding something?" His question struck her like a thunderbolt. She looked up suddenly, as if caught in the act. "What do you mean?" she replied, her tone tinged with surprise, though her expression remained cold. "I noticed how you behaved tonight. You seemed completely different. You were so distant, and with John, things felt far too close. I just want to know what's going on." Rick's voice softened, betraying the storm of emotions within him. He tried to mask how deeply it troubled him. Bella stayed silent for a long moment before saying, "It's nothing, Rick. You're overreacting. Sometimes holiday parties can just feel overwhelming." "I don't know what else to say." Her calm tone only deepened Rick's unease. Was it all in his head? Or was Bella truly hiding something he hadn't seen before? Their conversation was cut short as they arrived home. Bella stepped out of the car without a word and walked toward the door. Rick stayed seated behind the wheel, staring at her back. His doubts grew, and he couldn't figure out how to move forward. What was his wife hiding? Rick couldn't sleep. His thoughts wouldn't leave him alone. Bella, his wife, had always been open and honest with him, but tonight everything felt different. His suspicions wouldn't let him rest. Was she really who she seemed to be, or were there secrets hiding behind her sweet exterior that he had failed to notice before? Tossing and turning, He couldn't shake the uneasy thoughts. What was he supposed to do when there was no evidence, only a gnawing feeling that something was wrong? Deep down, Rick knew it wasn't just paranoia. Something had genuinely changed in their marriage. He glanced at the clock on the wall, midnight. Gathering his thoughts, he decided he needed to talk to Bella. Another evening clouded by unspoken tension wouldn't solve anything. In his eyes, she had become a stranger again. How had he failed to notice it until now? The next morning, as he had promised himself, Rick left for work early, almost as if avoiding home felt safer. The office was empty, with no colleagues yet present, and the only sound breaking the silence was the distant cries of seagulls through the window. Sitting at his desk, staring at his monitor, he struggled to organize his thoughts. How could he trust her when even her looks felt cold? An hour later, the office doors finally opened, and his coworker Sarah arrived. She had been a longtime friend of Bella's, though they hadn't seemed as close lately. Rick had often noticed the subtle furrow in Sarah's brow whenever Bella was around, but he'd always dismissed it as trivial. Sarah approached Rick with a cup of coffee, exuding a strange aura of concern. "Rick, how are you?" Her question sounded casual, but there was something different in her tone. "I'm fine, but," he hesitated, then let it out. "Sarah, is everything okay with Bella?" Sarah raised her eyebrows in surprise and asked, "What do you mean?" "She's been acting strange lately. I can't figure out what's going on," Rick admitted, unable to hide his unease. Sarah sat down opposite him, her expression turning serious. She drew in a sharp breath before replying, "Rick, you have to understand that people change sometimes, and it's not always something we want to see." Her words hit him like a gut punch. What did she mean? Why was she speaking so cryptically? "I mean that Bella might be going through something," she continued. "It doesn't necessarily mean it's bad. Maybe she's just searching for something new in her life. Changing." Rick sat in silence, his heart growing heavier. He couldn't understand why Sarah, who had always supported their relationship, was suddenly speaking so candidly about Bella. Something about her words only fueled his worry. "You're saying she's just changing?" His voice sounded too calm even to himself. Sarah sighed, glancing to the side. "Rick, I can't tell you everything, but you need to accept that people aren't always fully open, even with those closest to them. Maybe she just needs some time to figure out what she wants." Her words stirred new thoughts in Rick's mind. Could it be that this wasn't what he thought? Was Bella simply searching for herself, as so many people do at their age? Yet, something inside him wouldn't let go of his doubts. After work, Rick returned home, feeling as though his world had been turned upside down. Bella greeted him at the table, dressed in casual clothes, but something about her didn't feel right. It was a moment when everything familiar became uncertain. Bella looked at him differently. Again, that coldness, that distance. "Hi," she said, averting her gaze slightly as Rick entered the living room. "Hi," he replied, then added, trying to remain as calm as possible, "I talked to Sarah today." Bella froze, her eyes growing sharper, more cautious. "And what did she say?" Her voice took on a colder edge. Rick took a deep breath, trying to maintain his emotional balance. "She said you're going through some changes. Maybe that's true, but I still feel like something is going on. You're not the same as you used to be. I feel like you're drifting away from me." Silence filled the room. Bella kept her gaze fixed on him, but didn't say a word. Rick understood that this was the moment when everything could change. How would she respond? Rick felt as though his body no longer existed, as if he were just an empty shell filled with panic. All his thoughts, emotions, and even his breath were directed at that small gift under the Christmas tree. His heart pounded as he struggled to comprehend what he held in his hands. Bella remained silent, and her silence carried more weight than any words could. Rick picked up the gift, which bore the inscription, "This is for you, sweetheart. Can't wait for our night together." This was not just a card or an inappropriate note from some friend or relative. It was something special, something from someone who expected to share a night with her. He couldn't hold back and looked up at Bella. Her expression hadn't changed. She sat turned away, as if nothing had happened. "Is this some kind of joke?" Rick uttered, hardly believing his own words. Bella sighed deeply and looked at him. Her face showed neither regret nor fear, only a dullness that pushed him toward conclusions he didn't want to make. "I'm tired, Rick. Really tired," she said, her voice even, almost indifferent. "I just need some time for myself. This isn't the right moment to talk." Rick said nothing. His mind raced for an explanation, but he couldn't find one. The gift, the note, it was all too obvious to leave room for doubt. The person who had written it was waiting for her that very night. And that someone was clearly not Rick. His heart was filled with a whirlwind of emotions. Hurt, anger, disappointment, but most of all, betrayal. He couldn't deny the reality anymore. He felt as though he had been deceived. "I understand," he finally said, his voice flat as he suppressed his emotions. "I won't bother you anymore." With those words, he carefully placed the gift back under the tree and, without waiting for her response, left the room. The dim light from the window illuminated the hallway as he disappeared down it. Rick walked to his room, trying not to look back. He didn't know what to do next. His heart raced as though it was trying to escape from his chest. His mind was flooded with memories. All the shared moments with Bella, their history, and everything they had built together. And now, he saw it all from a different perspective. No matter how difficult it was, he couldn't fool himself any longer. He had been betrayed. Sitting alone in his room, he realized it was time to act. How had this happened? How had he missed all the signs? His body tensed as he thought about it. The gift, the note, it wasn't innocent. What do you do when you lose trust in the person you've been with for so long? Meanwhile, in the living room, Bella remained seated, staring at the tree. She didn't move. The real game was just beginning, and she knew Rick would search for answers. She knew he couldn't let it go. And he was right. She couldn't hide the truth any longer. But the real question was, could he forgive her? No one expected Rick to stay calm. He and Bella had shared years of emotional exchanges, but had she ever really been the person he thought she was? He felt deceived. This was more than just a breach of trust. It was as if his entire world had been built on lies, and now it had crumbled. He got up and walked to the window. The streetlights cast shadows outside. Rick felt like he couldn't breathe. What was happening? Was there any chance of fixing this? He wasn't prepared for such a shock. Looking at the gift left him feeling that Bella was no longer the same. Her eyes now seemed foreign, distant. He stood by the window, gazing at the city, at the people who likely had no idea about his pain. The night faded, but he couldn't let it all go. The more he thought about what had happened, the more he realized this didn't happen by chance. Now he needed answers. He had no other choice. But when would he truly understand how much deceit had infiltrated their relationship? How could he find his way out of this labyrinth of doubt? He knew that nothing would ever be the same. Rick sat at the table, slightly relieved after Bella told him that all the notes and gifts were just a joke. At first, a wave of relief washed over him. She had denied it, which meant it wasn't as bad as he feared. He still loved her, and she knew it. So she couldn't be that cruel. But something in her words, in her eyes, made him doubt. Bella approached him and hugged him from behind. Her hand rested on his shoulder as she wrapped her arms around his waist. Her soft breath on his neck was familiar, and Rick tried to return to that feeling of warmth. She said, "Rick, you know I love you. It was just a joke. Don't take it so seriously. We've always loved to have fun, and this was nothing serious." She smiled, but he still felt that her words didn't sound entirely sincere. Something was off. Usually, when Bella joked, her eyes sparkled with amusement, but this time they seemed clouded. They lacked the usual glow he had always seen. She tried to appear casual, but he couldn't bring himself to believe her. "Well, fine," Rick said, trying to smile, but his voice was strained. "Just don't lie to me anymore, okay? I want to be sure there are no secrets between us." Bella only nodded and smiled, but Rick noticed how she quickly turned away and walked to the mirror. He couldn't help but notice her fingers trembling nervously as she adjusted her hair. It was a small gesture, but for Rick, it spoke volumes. "Rick," she said after a few minutes, finally turning back to him, "I need to go out for a few hours to pick up some gifts. You don't mind, right?" The words seemed entirely normal at first. She always did this during the holiday season, buying him gifts or taking time for personal shopping. They had a tradition, Bella was always responsible for the Christmas presents, but this time, Rick felt something odd in her behavior. He couldn't explain why, but a sense of suspicion began to consume him. "Not so fast, Bella," he said, trying to mask the doubts that were becoming increasingly evident. "Maybe you want to talk about what's going on? Why can't I stop thinking about that gift under the tree?" Bella hesitated, and Rick saw her face grow tense as she nervously tucked her hair behind her ear. Her hand trembled for a moment before she took a deep breath and responded. "I don't know, Rick. Maybe I did go too far with the jokes. But let's not dwell on this now. I just want to go pick up the gifts. It's not a big deal." Her words were calm, but her gaze avoided his, and that was too much for Rick. He couldn't explain why, but he felt something was off. He couldn't believe it was just a joke. It didn't match her usual behavior. Bella had always been honest with him, even when they faced difficulties. And now, with this new secret, he felt she was hiding something. "Do you promise you'll come back and talk to me about this?" he asked, his eyes filled with nervous concern. "Yes, of course," she replied, turning to smile again. But her smile looked forced. "I don't want you to worry. Just a couple of hours, okay?" Rick nodded, though a growing anxiety filled his heart. Bella put on her favorite red dress, the same one she wore during their first holidays together. It was perfectly chosen to be attractive, but it didn't give him peace of mind. It was strange. Instead of wearing something casual, she had chosen something that left him with more questions. "Why?" "Rick, I'll be back soon," she said, trying to leave the room. He watched her back as she walked out the door, and his thoughts began to race. Something wasn't right, and he couldn't just sit and wait for it to resolve. Instead of letting his suspicions remain unspoken, Rick decided it was time to uncover the truth. Were the things he had seen and heard really what they seemed? He got dressed, deciding to follow her without letting Bella know. He needed to find out where she was going and who she was spending time with. Maybe it was too much, but he couldn't just sit idly any longer. He had to know if she was truly hiding something important from him. It was a risk, but his instincts told him it was the only right choice. Rick quietly followed Bella, trying to remain as inconspicuous as possible. He kept a safe distance, watching her every step, and though he tried to push his doubts aside, they were impossible to ignore. For months now, Bella had been different, distant, reserved, focused on work. She often stayed late, and when she came home, their conversations had become shallow and superficial. She no longer seemed interested in his days as she used to. Most troubling of all, she had become increasingly secretive, rarely sharing details about her life. And when she did, her explanations were vague and lacking substance. Rick had tried not to assume the worst, but his mind was already full of questions. What had happened to her? He recalled how they used to talk for hours about everything under the sun, how their evenings had always been shared, where they went, what they bought, what they planned together. Even when they argued, they always found a way to compromise. But now, Bella had become more withdrawn, and the fear in Rick's heart grew that this was about something much larger than just stress at work. She walked down the street, occasionally disappearing from view. Rick felt his heart tighten with every step she took. He was so certain that something was happening that his fingers fidgeted restlessly. There was no doubt anymore. He had to find out what she was hiding. Finally, Bella entered a shopping mall. Rick stopped at the entrance, his heart pounding, ensuring she wouldn't notice his presence. He waited a few minutes to make sure there was no other possibility. She had definitely gone inside. Then he followed her, maintaining a careful distance. She walked between the stores, glancing at items, but her focus seemed scattered. Rick began to wonder if she was truly looking for something specific or just running from something. While she stayed in another store, Rick began reflecting on what had been happening recently. Why was she no longer the Bella he knew and loved? He understood that this wasn't just a change in mood. It felt more like estrangement. Could it have been because of work? Maybe she was going through something difficult? But why had her changes become so abrupt? When she left the store, Rick decided it was better to let the matter go and not dwell on it. He still couldn't shake off the thoughts about the note on the tree, but resolved not to confront her right then and there. He moved slowly, trying not to appear suspicious. But as he turned his head to the side, he saw Bella meeting a man near the entrance of another store. Something inside Rick flipped. She greeted him with such warmth that Rick realized this wasn't just an acquaintance. Her gaze was softer than usual, and her smile more expressive. The man was tall, dressed in a dark coat, with a kind demeanor and a confident look, but Rick couldn't help but notice how he looked at Bella, with some interest, perhaps even passion. They went into a clothing store together, and Rick began to lose his composure. Why had she met him here, in the mall? Who was this man with whom she was so at ease? These questions swirled in Rick's mind as he followed them in disbelief. Bella and the man talked, laughed, and Rick could no longer bear it. They entered the store, and after some time, Rick saw Bella step out of the fitting room wearing a festive costume. It was a Santa outfit, a short skirt, stockings, a mask on her face, and Bella looked stunning. Rick couldn't take his eyes off her figure. She was incredibly attractive, and her appearance reignited feelings he once had for her. But now, his heart felt more than just amazement. She turned to the man, and Rick saw how he gave her an appraising look. Bella laughed, and seemed as though she wasn't his wife at all. All his doubts turned into raging anxiety. What was going on? Why was she buying a festive costume? And why wasn't he the only one seeing her in it? The minutes Rick spent watching them through the store window felt endless. He couldn't imagine that this was happening. Betrayal. But what else could it be? Every glance, every movement between them now seemed strange to him. How could they possibly be so close? Finally, after an hour in the store, Bella and the man headed toward the dressing room. Rick couldn't understand why they were staying there for so long. He watched through the store window, counting the minutes. What were they doing in there? This couldn't have been a coincidence. There were no more doubts. Rick decided that he couldn't wait any longer. He needed to go home and leave this question unresolved for now. Then he could find out more and decide what to do next. Rick arrived home, but his mind couldn't find peace. He sat on the couch, staring at the wall, but his gaze was empty. His thoughts swirled around what had happened at the mall. Bella and that man. Who was he? Rick tried to rationalize that maybe it was just an innocent coincidence. Maybe the man really was helping her pick out a gift for him? But why had they been in the fitting room for an entire hour? It looked incredibly suspicious, even if she pretended it was just a trusted acquaintance. Rick buried his face in his hands, trying to sort through his thoughts. She couldn't have betrayed him. He loved her so much that he couldn't even imagine such a thing. They'd been together for years. All those Christmas holidays, the spirit of love, and her warm words. She always said she loved him. So why was everything so strange now? He tried to calm himself by recalling moments from their life together. Times when they laughed, exchanged gifts. Rick clearly remembered the surprise he gave her last Christmas and how overjoyed she had been. They had always trusted each other, and if something had changed, he needed to know why. But at the moment, it was hard to even collect his thoughts. Meanwhile, the door opened, and Bella returned home. She looked the same as she had before leaving. She hadn't changed her appearance, and Rick felt his heart tighten, though he tried to remain calm. "Hi," she said, walking toward him with a smile. "Hi," Rick replied, though his voice was much calmer than he felt. He looked at her intently, trying to figure out if there was anything he hadn't noticed before. Bella placed a gift on the table and, without waiting for questions, began explaining, "I bought something for you, for Christmas. I hope you'll like it." She presented a beautifully wrapped box in golden paper. Rick was surprised. It was an incredibly expensive gift, at first glance, nothing like what he would have expected from an ordinary purchase for him. He tried not to look too startled as he began carefully unwrapping it. Inside the box, he found an elegant watch, the kind he had seen in luxury brand displays, undoubtedly very expensive. Again, where had she gotten the money for such a gift? Rick began to feel uneasy. She had never spent so much on gifts, even for important holidays. Everything was beginning to seem even more suspicious. "Wow, this is incredible," Rick said, trying to hide his astonishment. "I really wanted to make you happy. You like things like this, don't you?" Bella said, looking at him with joy. Rick nodded, but his mind was elsewhere. Why was she suddenly buying such expensive things? And why now? He didn't know if she had new financial opportunities, but something told him there was more to this than just a desire to please him. "There's something I don't know about you, Bella," Rick thought, but he couldn't say it out loud. It would have sounded too suspicious. The next moment, Bella decided to share another piece of news. "By the way," she said, approaching him again, "we've been invited to visit an old friend. He's an excellent masseur, a very skilled professional. I think it'll be a wonderful gift for both of us." Rick paused for a few seconds, processing her words. A massage from another man? It seemed a little odd. Not that he didn't believe her friend might actually be a great masseur, but the whole situation was starting to look suspicious. "A massage," Rick repeated. "Is that something you really want?" "Yes, it'll be great. He's a real professional, just perfect for relaxation. You don't mind, do you?" Bella replied, smiling as if she didn't understand why this could raise any questions. Rick could have asked why this particular man, why she was praising him so much, but at the last moment, he decided not to provoke any unnecessary tension. He already felt something was off, but didn't want to show Bella that he was suspicious. "All right," he finally said, "let's go, and you can introduce me to your friend." But deep in his heart, he no longer felt as certain as he once did. Everything seemed too good to be true. A masseur? The same man from the store, the one she seemed so close with? What did this all mean? His mind raced, and his heart felt as though it was slowly cracking under the weight of an unknown fear he could no longer suppress. They started preparing for the trip, but for Rick, one thing had become clear. He needed to find out more about what was happening. Something wasn't right, and he wouldn't let it remain unanswered. Rick began getting ready, putting on his suit. He tried not to show how confused and nervous he was, but it was hard to hide. While getting ready, he noticed Bella taking the costume she had tried on the day before at the shopping mall. It was the same costume with the mask and short skirt, which Rick thought looked very provocative. He summoned all his willpower not to react outwardly. It was highly suspicious, as Rick now knew for sure that this costume wasn't for him, and he could no longer ignore these troubling signals. If he hadn't been so convinced of his love for Bella, he would have long suspected that she was involved with someone else. But he wasn't ready to admit that yet. He just needed clarity to understand what was really going on. Bella stepped out of the bathroom, and Rick couldn't help but notice how much she had changed. She was wearing a new dress that looked incredibly elegant and beautiful, along with heavy makeup. Her lips were bright red, and she looked more radiant than ever before. She had never dressed like this for an ordinary evening at home. Everything seemed meticulously planned. "Why are you so dressed up?" Rick asked, trying to mask his anxiety with a calm demeanor. "I just want to look good," she replied with a smile, as if it were the most natural desire in the world. "We're going to visit a friend. I'm not going to look sloppy. That's all. There's nothing wrong with it." But Rick couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Why was she dressing as though she were attending a special event, and why was it so important to her now? He had more questions than answers. His heart raced, and he couldn't stop the suspicions from creeping in, even if they seemed absurd. After that, they got in the car, and Rick couldn't stop thinking about the fact that they were going to meet the same man he had seen at the shopping mall the day before. That man, the one who had been so close to Bella in the fitting room. Why had she brought him into her life so quickly? When they arrived and Rick saw the man, he immediately sensed something odd. Something wasn't right. The man was overly confident, too relaxed. He extended his hand to Rick, who tried to be polite but couldn't shake the feeling that there was some hidden connection between them. "Hi, Rick. Nice to meet you," the man said, though Rick felt the gesture was too friendly for a first meeting. "Hi," Rick replied curtly, trying to hide his dissatisfaction. He sat on the couch, waiting as Bella went to another room to change. Everything was as he had expected. He heard the door close and then heard the man's footsteps as he followed her. At first, Rick didn't react, but his heart began to race. Why did everything feel so strange? Why was this man so casually following Bella? Rick tried to settle into a comfortable position, trying not to appear overly suspicious, but the longer he waited, the harder it became to breathe. Then he heard strange noises from the other room. Bella's voice, at first quiet, but then loud and angry. Rick couldn't understand what was happening. It sounded like pain or something more. "Is everything okay?" Rick asked, barely holding back the panic in his voice. "Yes, everything's fine," Bella replied, her voice sounding distracted but calm. "It's just a massage. I'm enjoying it." Everything's fine. But her words didn't reassure Rick. His sense of unease only grew. He sat and waited for a few more minutes, trying to make sense of what was happening behind the door. But the longer he waited, the more it seemed like something was wrong. His mind was running at full capacity, and all his thoughts boiled down to one thing. This was betrayal. Rick couldn't take it anymore. He got up, tried to summon the strength to confront Bella, but his heart refused the idea. Grabbing his coat, he decided to leave. Without saying goodbye, without a word. All he wanted was to make sense of what he had just witnessed. His mind was filled with painful questions, and there was no going back. When he got home, he realized he was alone again. His heart ached with doubt, but he couldn't keep searching for answers in these chaotic thoughts. He simply sat at home, waiting for Bella to return. All he could think about was whether this was real or if he was just overthinking things. But he couldn't shake the painful certainty in his heart that his wife was hiding something from him. Rick woke up the next morning with a heavy heart and a pounding headache. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, his mind looping through the same thoughts. Why had Bella come home so late? And why did she look the way she did? His heart still raced with anxiety, but he tried to put the questions aside. He needed sleep, but his thoughts wouldn't let him rest. When he opened his eyes, Bella was already home. She quietly sat by his bed, gently stroking his shoulder, and smiled as she said, "Still sleeping? I thought you'd be up by now." Rick blinked a few times, unsure if this was reality or just a dream. She looked as if nothing had happened, as if they hadn't spent the entire night in doubt and worry. His heart swallowed another dose of anxiety as he heard her voice. "What happened?" he mumbled, slightly surprised that she had returned home so casually. "Why did you leave so early?" she asked. Her question went unanswered, but her voice was light and carefree, as always. "My friend gave me a massage, and then some friends came over, and we all had fun together all night." Rick couldn't help but feel that her words evoked a sense of artificial ease, as though her explanation was too polished, too perfect to be true. Something was off. He looked at her, feeling his doubts grow stronger, and clenched his fists to suppress his emotions. He still didn't know what to do with the questions tearing him apart inside. "Are you sure you were there with him and your friends?" Rick asked, watching her closely. His voice sounded calm, but inside, he already felt empty and anxious. Bella smiled and pulled out her phone, showing him a few photos. The images did, indeed, show people, various acquaintances, and her with the same man from the shopping mall the day before. They were laughing, hugging, and looking completely carefree. Everything seemed very friendly, as though they were simply spending time together as old friends. Rick didn't know what to think. There she was, his Bella, looking completely calm. Yet, he couldn't shake the feeling that this didn't align with his idea of what their relationship should be. Something didn't add up, but he couldn't pinpoint what. "Do you mind if we host a party at home, too?" Bella said unexpectedly, further confusing Rick. "We could dress up nicely, wear costumes, and invite this man over." Her words hit him like a thunderclap. Rick felt his fingers go numb, and even his heart seemed to stop for a moment. This was all too strange. Once again, he was witnessing how an ordinary situation began to turn unusual and unpredictable. "I don't know," Rick said, trying to mask his feelings. "Honestly, I'm not sure I want that man in our house again." But Bella wasn't giving up. She was as stubborn as ever, and her gaze was very convincing. "Why are you so worried? It's just a party, just for some fun. Besides, I want us to make more friends and spend time together." Rick hesitated. He didn't like the idea of inviting this man to their home. Something about it felt wrong, but he couldn't express his doubts the way he wanted to. He couldn't say no to her when she seemed so persuasive, so normal, when everything seemed like nothing more than an ordinary party invitation. "All right," Rick said, feeling his heart clench, "but I want to go and buy myself a costume. I can't just show up in anything if we're going to celebrate." Bella readily agreed, and Rick tried to convince himself that it didn't matter, that all of this could just be a simple party. And yet, his heart felt heavy. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss, that this wasn't just a friendly invitation, and that something between him and Bella had changed. But when he was alone, his doubts intensified. He could no longer be sure of what was happening. Was it really just a party? Or was there something deeper in her relationship with that man? All these questions swirled in his mind, and he didn't know how to find answers. But one thing was clear. His heart could no longer calmly accept every step, every glance, and every word from Bella. Rick stood by the bathroom door, watching Bella stand in front of the mirror, trying on her costume. It was the same costume she had bought at the mall, a dark outfit with a provocative short skirt, black stockings, and a mask that added an air of mystery. She looked stunning, and Rick couldn't help but notice how hard his heart was pounding in his chest as he gazed at his wife. She truly looked incredible, but with every look at her, his feelings only worsened. The costume was too revealing, too provocative, and he found it hard to believe she had bought it just to attend a party with friends. It all made him uneasy, and his anxiety grew with her every move. Something wasn't right. "Aren't you going to go get your costume?" she asked, without taking her eyes off the mirror, as she shifted her pose to look better in the outfit. Rick approached her and took her hand. He looked at her as if she were something extraordinary, but at the same time, he couldn't rid himself of the feeling that his inner world was beginning to crumble. "Maybe I'll stay home, and we can spend time together," he said, trying to get the words out despite the pain he felt. "You look amazing in this costume. I really like you in it. Maybe we can forget about all this and just be together?" He touched her shoulder, hoping for a response he wanted to hear, at least a little sympathy or warmth. But instead, he heard her cold, almost detached voice. "This isn't for you, Rick," she said, turning to him with eyes so distant it crushed him even more. "This is for the party, and I'm waiting for my friend to arrive. I already told you. So go get your costume before he gets here." Her words cut through his heart like knives. He stood there, looking at her as though she were a stranger. She didn't seem to notice the pain he was experiencing, nor did she feel the growing distance between them. Rick felt her words push him further away, widening the gap between them. He felt empty. It seemed as though the entire world had stopped around him, and his soul was no longer ready to bear this emotional coldness. Confused and broken, Rick silently grabbed his coat and left the house. All his thoughts, all his feelings felt like an unbearable burden that he simply couldn't handle. Each step, every moment on his way to the store felt meaningless. His hands trembled, and his face was hidden from the world. He couldn't hold back his tears, and as he got into the car, he broke down crying. Why was his wife so cold to him? Why did he feel like she completely disregarded his feelings? Rick couldn't understand why this man kept appearing in their lives. Why did he have to put up with Bella's detachment? And why, when he tried to be close to her, did she push him away as if none of it mattered to her? On the way to the store, he couldn't help but notice the tears falling onto the steering wheel. He didn't want to be like this. He wanted to love her. But why then did he feel like he couldn't trust her anymore? He drove aimlessly, unaware of how much time had passed. It was hard for him to organize his thoughts. Rick didn't want to believe that this was betrayal. He loved Bella so much that he refused to see the truth, even if it was staring him in the face. He still hoped that everything could be fixed, that perhaps his fears were just in his head, and that he was worrying unnecessarily. But what did it matter if doubts lingered? He felt alone, and no one understood how hard it was for him. All his efforts to keep their relationship intact seemed futile, and what tormented him most was that he couldn't find the courage to openly talk to Bella about it. When he finally arrived at the store, he did what he had to do. Chose a costume that he thought would be suitable for the party and paid for it. But everything about it felt empty and meaningless. He returned home carrying the bag with the costume, but his soul felt hollow. When he entered the apartment, he saw Bella already standing in front of the mirror in the same costume. She looked stunning, but he no longer had the strength to appreciate her appearance. All he felt was inner pain, a sense of fracture. And even when he told her he had bought the costume, his words came out like automatic responses, devoid of meaning. All that remained in his soul were questions. Why? Why had everything turned out like this? Is there still a chance to set things right? Rick sat in his living room, staring at the costume he had bought for the party. He tried to stay calm, though he felt his heart pounding with anger and disappointment. Bella was in the other room, preparing food, and for some reason, he felt that this dinner might be their last. His thoughts were interrupted when the door opened, and he saw Bella's acquaintance walk into the apartment. Bella greeted him with an enthusiastic look. She smiled widely and immediately hugged him, then kissed him on the cheek. Rick couldn't bear it. Every move Bella made filled him with more dissatisfaction and anxiety. It was like a blow to his dignity. He didn't know whether he wanted to stay and watch what was happening or leave the place entirely, but remaining here felt unbearable. "Hi, Rick," the man greeted him, extending his hand. "Great to see you." Rick tried to remain polite and shook the man's hand, but his inner resistance was hard to suppress. "You're looking good," the man said, glancing at Rick. "Did you get a new suit?" "It's fantastic." Rick didn't know how to respond. He simply nodded and sat at the table, watching Bella prepare dinner. Something was wrong. He tried to appear calm, but his gaze couldn't leave Bella's acquaintance. All his suspicions were being confirmed. Meanwhile, Bella started praising the man, talking about his massage skills, which she described as absolutely incredible. "You're truly great at it," she said to him. "And your outfit today is just stunning. How did you find something so elegant?" Rick watched this and felt his patience wearing thin. He couldn't understand what was going on or why he increasingly felt like a stranger in his own home. "If you're such an expert," Rick said, trying to maintain a shred of dignity, "why don't you give me a massage? After all, if you're so good at it, why not try?" The man smiled and responded, but his words only added fuel to Rick's burning doubts. "Sorry, buddy, I only work with women. I'm not interested in other clients." Rick felt his inner world collapse again. The sight of this man, his excessive attention to Bella, it all felt like a massive lie. Rick thought that maybe all of it, everything he had been experiencing, all his suspicions, was actually true. At that moment, Bella unexpectedly turned to the man, took his hand, and said, "Let's go. You can give me a massage. We'll leave Rick at the table to enjoy his dinner." Rick felt his heart break. He couldn't believe what was happening right in front of him. Bella walked away, holding the man's hand, and Rick sat there, watching them. She didn't even look back. There was no remorse or regret in her eyes. She just walked into the room as if it were the most normal thing in the world. Rick sat at the table, unable to speak. His soul boiled with anger. He didn't even know what to do next. All his assumptions, all his fears had now become reality. He heard the door close, and now there was only one question left. What was happening behind those doors? He listened to the sounds from the other room, and then he heard her voice. The same cries he had heard before, cries that had once scared him. Now they were different. They were louder, more emotional. These were sounds he couldn't forget, and that confirmed his worst fears. It was betrayal. Rick couldn't take it anymore. He stood up and abruptly opened the door to that room, not thinking about what he was doing. What he saw shocked him. Bella and her acquaintance were together. His wife was in his arms, and the man was running his hands over her body. Rick felt the ground disappear beneath his feet. He couldn't believe what he was seeing with his own eyes. Bella looked at him, her face calm, even satisfied. Her eyes betrayed no guilt or regret. She simply looked at him and then turned her gaze back to her acquaintance. Rick could no longer stay in that house. He couldn't bear the sight. His heart shattered into a million pieces. He silently left the room, gathered his things, and walked out. All the emotions boiling inside him poured out as tears. He couldn't stop crying. He drove aimlessly, not knowing where he was going, only feeling the need to get far away from that house. His heart was crushed, and he couldn't understand how he had ended up in this place, faced with these terrible truths. When he finally arrived at his mother's house, it was only then that he could stop the storm inside him. He stood on her doorstep, crying, unable to believe that his life, his relationship with Bella, would never be the same again. The next day, Rick drove back to his house. He sat in his car, looking at the building where he had once lived with Bella. His heart was torn apart, but he no longer had the strength to grieve or cry. Whatever happened next, he didn't want to live in lies anymore. He wasn't going to forgive her. Everything he had felt up until that moment had turned into bitter pain and anger. Bella had broken every principle he held dear, and he knew there was no coming back from this. He stepped out of the car and headed to the door, each step feeling like a heavy weight pressing on his heart. Just yesterday, this was his home, his life, but today everything had changed. Rick wanted to regain his dignity, to take back control, even though it terrified him. When he entered, he heard laughter and voices coming from another room. It was Bella and that man. They were there together, not even trying to hide their presence. Bella was clearly happy, and that was a heavy blow to Rick. He knew he couldn't live within these walls anymore, but first, he needed to do something more. Before walking into the room, he carefully glanced at their faces through the open door. The man was laughing and saying something, while Bella sat beside him, looking at him with endless attention, as if everything between them was real and completely natural. Rick couldn't take it anymore. "Oh, this looks very cozy," he said as he stepped into the room. Both of them froze for a moment, looking at him. Rick held a bag containing the new costume he had bought for the party, the same one he no longer intended to wear. All he needed now was to keep his composure and show that he was strong. "Rick, you came back?" Bella asked, her voice sounding surprised but not unsettled. "Yes, I'm back," he replied, approaching the table. "I was getting ready to go to the party. But, actually, I changed my mind. I decided we'll spend today differently." She looked at him, not understanding what he meant, but Rick felt this was the moment for true revenge. It wouldn't be anger or physical actions. It would be intellectual, leaving her no room to recover. "Tell me, what's going on here?" Rick said, turning to the man. "It seems I've missed something important." The man, looking slightly tense, tried to change the subject. "Oh, nothing much. We're just friends," he said, glancing at Bella, but she didn't intervene. Rick looked at Bella. She seemed confident, but in her eyes, Rick noticed a hint of fear. She knew it would be hard to escape this situation once he exposed her. "Do you really think I don't know what's going on between you?" Rick asked coldly. "That you're no longer just playing the role of a friend, but a true lover? And this man isn't just an acquaintance, but the one who's made your life better." Rick took a breath, trying to control his emotions. Bella opened her mouth but couldn't say anything. She knew that any excuse she gave would only be lies. "Maybe yesterday, I was blind and didn't notice how you manipulated me," Rick continued. "But you've greatly underestimated me, Bella." She looked uncomfortable, and even the man, sensing the shift in atmosphere, stopped smiling. "You don't have the right to speak to me like that," Bella said, but her voice no longer sounded confident. "Do you really think I've forgotten how you looked at him in the mall? How you threw yourself at this man, even in bed? You don't even try to hide it. You don't even pretend to care about my feelings," Rick said, stepping closer to her. His eyes burned with intensity. "I understand why you're doing this, Bella. You want more than I can give. You want power and control. But I'm not going to sit here and watch this. And now that you've shown me who you truly are, I'll give you my answer." Bella didn't have time to respond when Rick pressed a button on his phone. Within minutes, the door opened. The man's face turned pale as several men entered the room, removing their masks, people Rick recognized from certain business dealings. "These guys are here to inform you that your freedom today has consequences," Rick said with satisfaction he couldn't hide. The man, realizing something was wrong, began looking around nervously, quickly understanding the seriousness of the situation. Bella froze, staring at them in shock. Rick laughed, knowing he had made the right decision. "These men will handle your affairs," he said, turning to the door. "I'm sorry, Bella, but I decide how we move forward now." Rick walked out of the house, feeling like his life was finally returning to normal. He had restored his dignity without resorting to violence, but showed he wouldn't allow himself to be deceived. Both the man and Bella faced the consequences of their actions. Now Rick was ready to start a new life, free of betrayal and lies. Could you forgive a loved one for betrayal?